Knispel grabbed my collar so hard I heard the fabric tear. "When I tell you to reverse, you reverse. No questions, no hesitation, or we all die." I was 19. I'd been his driver for 6 weeks. The Tiger II's Maybach engine was wheezing like a sick horse, barely holding idle after that last is two put around through our rear deck. Outside, 4 Soviet tanks were closing in a wide crescent. Flanking maneuver, exactly what our training said would kill us. Standard doctrine, abandon vehicle, escape on foot. But Knispel was already rotating the turret away from them, toward nothing, toward open ground. "Trust me," he said. Then, "Now." I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine screamed, coughed, and the Tiger II lurched backward maybe 3 meters before something in the transmission gave out with a grinding shriek that I can still hear when I close my eyes. We were done, truly done. The tank shuddered to a halt at a slight angle, nose dipping into a shallow depression I hadn't even noticed was there. Smoke was pouring from the engine compartment now. Hoffman was clutching his arm where shrapnel had torn through his sleeve, blood dripping onto the ammunition rack. Miller had his eyes pressed to the gun sight, hands frozen on the controls, waiting for an order that seemed impossible to give. And outside, through my periscope, I watched those Soviet tanks slow down. They weren't rushing anymore. Why would they? We were a crippled animal. They had all the time in the world. I'm 97 years old now. That was 80 years ago. And I still don't understand how one man did what Kurt Knispel did that morning. How does a crippled tank, immobilized, outnumbered, outflanked, become the most dangerous thing on the battlefield? How does a man see angles that don't exist? They gave medals to pilots and generals. Knispel? Most people have never heard his name. 168 confirmed tank kills, maybe more, the highest score in history, and he died 3 days before the war ended, buried in a grave no one has ever found. But that morning, that one impossible morning in January 1945, I saw what he could do when everyone had written him off, when his own crew thought it was over. Eastern Front, January 1945. The Reich was bleeding out. Soviet Operation Vistula Oder had broken through everything. 5 million Red Army soldiers pushing west like a tide that couldn't be stopped. We were part of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, Tiger Platoons, the heaviest tanks in the war. Our job was simple: slow them down long enough for the civilians to run. That morning, we weren't slowing anyone down. We were trapped. Knispel wasn't like other commanders, no officer's commission, despite being the deadliest tank killer in the entire war. They said he was too wild, too insubordinate. He wore his hair long, against regulations. He had a dog, a mutt he'd found somewhere in Ukraine, and he refused to leave it behind, even when high command threatened discipline. They hated him for it. His crew would have followed him into hell. I can still feel the cold that morning. -20, maybe colder. The kind of cold that makes your eyelashes freeze together when you blink. The kind that turns breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The Tiger II was the most powerful tank in the world and the most temperamental. 70 tons of steel and firepower. The 88-millimeter cannon could kill anything at 2 kilometers. But if the engine died, if the track threw, if the transmission failed, you became a pillbox, a coffin with a good gun. Ours had stopped being a tank about 10 minutes earlier. We just hadn't accepted it yet. 4 hours before all of this, We'd been sleeping inside the hull for warmth. Hoffman was snoring against the ammunition rack, his breath fogging in the dark. He was 22, a farmer's son from Bavaria who told jokes constantly because the alternative was screaming. Muller sat in the gunner's seat, even in his sleep, hands resting near the controls. Former watchmaker, precise, quiet. His hands never shook, not even when everything around him was shaking. Young Brant was curled up near the radio, 18 years old, writing letters to a girl back home who had stopped writing back 3 months ago. He didn't know yet, or maybe he did and couldn't face it. Knispel was awake. He was always awake before the rest of us, checking the gun, talking to himself about ballistics, feeding scraps to that dog of his. I watched him through half-closed eyes that morning, running his fingers along the barrel of the .88, whispering numbers. He knew that gun better than he knew his own hands. The radio crackled around 0500, Soviet breakthrough 12 kilometers east, closer than yesterday, closer than anyone wanted to admit. Our orders came down. Recon patrol to check a village for enemy activity. Standard mission. Nothing we hadn't done 100 times. We rolled out at first light, tracks crunching through frozen crust, the forest closing around us like something holding its breath. Snow hung heavy on the branches. No birds, no wind, just the rumble of our engine and the creak of frozen wood. I've been in quiet places since then. Churches, libraries, the room where my wife died. None of them were as quiet as that forest. It was the silence of something waiting. We found the supply truck about 2 kilometers from the village, German markings, still burning, but not from combat. No bullet holes, no shell damage. The crew was gone. Just gone, like they'd stepped out for a cigarette and never come back. "Stop the tank," Knispel said. I stopped. He climbed up through the commander's hatch, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the tree line in every direction. A full minute passed, then another. "They're not ahead of us," he said finally. "They're around us." That's when I saw the glint in the trees, sunlight on glass, a periscope, someone watching us from maybe 200 meters away. The first shell hit before I could even call it out. The impact threw me against the controls so hard I bit through my lip. The track snapped, the engine coughed, and suddenly we were exactly what we'd been trained to fear. A stationary target in hostile territory. Hoffman was screaming about his arm. Brandt was trying to raise command on the radio, but all that came back was static. Müller had his hands on the gun controls, traversing toward the sound of the impact, but Knispel stopped him. "No, traverse away from them." We all thought he'd lost his mind. Through my periscope, I counted the enemy tanks as they emerged from the tree line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 T-34s, spreading out in a wide formation, moving to encircle us. Textbook annihilation of a crippled vehicle. They weren't even hurrying. Why would they? We were dead. We just didn't know it yet. But Knispel was doing something I didn't understand. He was using the slight depression our tank had settled into, angling the hull, calculating something in his head. I could see his lips moving. "They think we're finished," he said quietly. "They're not even watching. They're already dividing up the credit." He turned to Hoffman, who was still gripping his bleeding arm. "Stop loading. Save your strength. We're going to need you." To Müller, "Don't fire, not until I tell you. Let them close." to me, "When I say now, I need you to do something with this tank that you're going to think is impossible. Trust me." And then he waited. The Soviets kept coming. 800 meters, 700, 600. They were confident now, spreading wider, some of them turning slightly to cut off retreat routes we didn't have anyway. One tank had stopped, engine trouble or maybe a more cautious commander, but the others kept rolling forward. Hoffman was getting pale, too much blood loss. But he wouldn't stop positioning shells, dragging them closer with his one good arm so he could load faster when the moment came. Muller's hands were steady on the triggers, ice crystals forming on his eyebrows, but his eyes never left the gun sight. Brandt had finally raised a German unit on the backup radio. 8 kilometers away. They couldn't help us. "Hold your position," they said, like we had a choice. 500 meters, 400, inside the range where their guns could penetrate our armor, inside the range where our advantage disappeared. Knispel kissed a St. Christopher medal, the only time I ever saw him pray. "Now or never," he said. "They're bunching up. Do you see it?" I looked through my periscope, and I saw it. In their confidence, the Soviet tanks had clustered together, following the terrain toward what they thought was an easy kill. 3 of them were almost in a line. "Müller, the lead tank, side armor, take your time." Müller fired. The round caught the T-34 just behind the turret. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hatches blew off, and fire erupted from every seam, and a man came climbing out, with his uniform already burning. Then everything was noise and fire and death, and I understood why they called Knispel the Panzerknacker. The remaining Soviets scattered, but they were too close now, too bunched together. Müller was already traversing, and Knispel was calling adjustments in fractions of degrees, reading the terrain, anticipating where each tank would move before it moved. Second kill, a T-34 at 300 meters. The round hit the turret ring, and the whole top of the tank lifted off like a cork from a bottle. Shell impacts on our hull. One bounced off the glacis. Knispel's angling had worked. Another gouged the turret but didn't penetrate. The Tiger II shuddered with each impact, but it held. Third kill, a T-34 trying to flank us, coming around our left side where the gun couldn't reach. Knispel saw it before I did. "Traverse! Traverse!" Müller swung the turret, and the round went through the driver's hatch at 200 meters. The tank rolled on for another few seconds. Dead men at the controls before it slammed into a tree and stopped. Inside our hull, everything was chaos, spent shell casings piling up, smoke thick enough to choke on, Hoffman loading with one arm, the other hanging useless, his face gray with shock. But he kept loading. He never stopped. 4th kill, 5th kill. The Soviets had stopped panicking now. The cautious commander who'd held back was organizing the survivors, using terrain, popping smoke grenades. Professionals. 3 tanks left, and they weren't going to make the same mistakes. A round punched through our rear deck. The engine compartment started smoking worse than before. We were burning now, slowly, and everyone knew it. Hoffman collapsed against the loader's seat, blood pooling on the floor. Brandt scrambled to take over loading, fumbling with shells he'd never handled in combat, but trying. God, he was trying. 3 rounds left, Knispel said. 3 tanks, no margin. The 6th kill was an ambush. Knispel baited a T-34 into moving from cover, and Müller put the round into its ammunition storage. The tank didn't just die, it came apart, pieces of it spinning through the air like leaves, two left, two rounds, and then the shell hit our mantlet. It didn't penetrate, but the impact jammed the turret traverse. The gun was locked. We couldn't aim. The last two Soviet tanks saw it. They started moving, separating, coming at us from angles we couldn't reach. This is where any other commander would have ordered us to abandon vehicle. This is where the war was supposed to end for us. Knispel looked at me. The broken track, can you pivot on it? I didn't understand at first. Then I did. The thrown track was dragging in the frozen ground. If I gunned the engine hard enough, used the working track against the resistance of the broken one, I might be able to pivot the entire hull, aim the whole tank like a gun. Insane, desperate, I tried it anyway. Metal screaming, frozen ground tearing. The Tiger II lurched, groaning, protesting, and then, slowly, it turned. 10 degrees, just enough to put one of the Soviets back in Miller's sights. 7th kill. One tank left. One round. Turret still jammed. The last Soviet stopped, just stopped, maybe 200 meters away. I could see the commander standing in his hatch, looking at us, looking at the 6 burning wrecks around him, looking at the Tiger II that should have been dead 10 minutes ago. He stood there for what felt like an hour. It was probably 5 seconds. Then slowly he reversed, turned, retreated through the trees until I couldn't see him anymore. Silence, real silent this time. Just the crackle of burning tanks and the groan of tortured metal cooling in the cold. Someone was crying. I don't know who. Nobody acknowledged it. Knispel slumped against the turret wall, and I saw for the first time how much blood was on his uniform, shrapnel in his side from the first hit. He'd commanded that entire engagement with metal in his guts. We got out, set thermite charges, burned the tank so the Soviets couldn't study it. Then we walked 8 kilometers through the snow, Hoffman on an improvised stretcher, Knispel refusing to be carried. I walk or I die, he said, same as always. We reached German lines at dawn, medical tent, hot coffee, the war still happening all around us. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. We just sat there, alive when we shouldn't be. Knispel recovered in 10 days, asked for a new tank, got one, went back to the front. That engagement added 6 more kills to his record, but there was no formal report, no recognition, no medal. The 7 Soviet tanks we destroyed that morning, they were part of a flanking force. Destroying them bought time for a hospital train to evacuate 200 wounded soldiers, men who lived because Kurt Knispel wouldn't quit, families that exist today because of what happened on that frozen road. Hoffman lost his arm but survived the war, went back to farming, had 4 children. Miller was killed 3 weeks later in another engagement. He never met his daughter, but she grew up with his photograph, the same one he showed me in the tank that morning. Brant survived everything, lives in Hamburg now. We still exchange Christmas cards. April 28, 1945, 3 days before Hitler killed himself, 11 days before Germany surrendered. Knispel's tank was hit near Verbovec, Czechoslovakia. He was pulled from the wreck alive, but he died within hours. 168 confirmed kills, the highest of any tank ace in history. 4 recommendations for the Knight's Cross, all denied because he didn't follow rules. His grave has never been found. I think about him every January, when it gets cold enough to freeze your breath. I remember the way he smelled, sweat and gun oil and that cheap tobacco he smoked. I remember his hands on the gun sight, the way he counted under his breath, the calm in the middle of everything burning. They ask me sometimes, "What did you learn in the war?" I don't know what to tell them. I learned that men die for no reason and live for no reason. I learned that the bravest people don't get medals. I learned that 70 tons of steel can become an extension of one man's will. But mostly, I learned this. That morning, when everything was finished, when my crew was ready to die, one man looked at an impossible situation and saw something the rest of us couldn't see. Let them get close. That's what he said. 4 words. And here I am, 80 years later, still trying to understand what he saw that we didn't. I don't think I ever will. Kurt Knispel, 168 confirmed, no grave, no medal, no statue, just me, still remembering, still here.